I'm Hans-Ulrich Obist, I'm Artistic Director of Serpentine. Our CEO, Bettina Korek, and I and all our teams are incredibly delighted to welcome you to the launch of Future Art Ecosystems 5, Art and Creative R&D, which is the latest strategic briefing produced and released by Serpentine Arts and Technologies. Published at the key moment with last week's release of the Creative Industry Sector Plan and the UK's Modern Industrial Strategy. Serpentine's Arts and Technologies is a department and also a program that explores the impact of technology through art, through research, and also through experimental projects. At the heart of it all is this idea of permanent experimentation, and it's interesting, of course, always to talk in this wonderful space of Zaha Hadid about experimentation, because I always remember that the day of the opening, when we sat here with Zaha, she wrote on a piece of paper that there should be no end to experimentation, ever. And of course, that is the mantra for us all here at the Serpentine. We do support artists to produce complex projects that use advanced technologies with a focus on creative R&D, production, and building teams, as you may have seen with commissions and exhibitions, such as Gabriel Massan and collaborators with the Third World, The Bottom Dimension in 2023. Then also here in North with The Call by Holly Herndon and Matt Dryhurst, which found a reiteration in South by Southwest, and we're delighted that Joe Payton is here tonight, with whom we collaborated on that. And of course, the forthcoming exhibition by Daniel Braithwaite-Shirley opening this September at Serpentine North. These new projects will explore the creative and civic potential of video game technologies, in particular game engines and also expanded forms of gaming that exist between both digital and physical contexts at the moment, where more than 3 billion people worldwide engage with video games. Drawing on our commissioning program and as part of our mission to continue building new connections between artists and society, Serpentine Arts Technologies convenes, develops new models, and also shares knowledge and ideas about technology and society for the sector and beyond. This is why it's also so important for us that these these Future Art Ecosystem publications are open source, are free for all, and can be downloaded. This should be for everyone, to quote a famous quote. And it's always working closely with individuals and organizations across art, technology, law, policy, civic, and also academia. For us, this work is also about bringing art into society. We are always inspired and still inspired every day by John Latham and Barbara Stevini and the Artist Placement Group, who taught us that we need artists out there in the world, not only in museums and exhibition spaces. And that's why we firmly believe that every company, every corporation, every ministry should have an artist on the board or an artist in residence contributing at early development stages of new technologies. And similarly, if you think about the APG, the Artist Placement Group idea of going outside the museum and migrating into society, it's actually a great possibility also that exhibitions can migrate into non-art contexts, so that actually exhibitions we do with technologies could migrate into education curricula, closed R&D labs, governmental departments, and many, many more. We are extremely delighted, of course, to always listen to artists, and you will hear from Kay Watson in a minute about this idea of listening, because FAIR is about many, many conversations. We spoke the other day with Ian Chang, who has always been a big fan of the FAIRs, and he says that the fifth one is by far the best one. He says FAIR 5 is FAIR 5 and everything else is everything else. And of course, Ian Chang has been essential for our experiments with art and technology, because Bob, Bag of Belief, was born here at the Serpentine, transforming Serpentine South into a space not unlike an animal sanctuary for new forms of 21st century life, as Ian actually called it. We're incredibly delighted that you're all here, and of course this would all not have been possible with the contribution by so many supporters, the generous supporters whose commitment to our mission ensure that we can do things like the project we present tonight, but that we can also remain free and open to all. So we are very grateful to our trustees, and we're so honored to have Ruth McKenzie here with us tonight, our amazing trustee. Give her a big round of applause. We are also incredibly grateful always to Bloomberg Philanthropies, to the Arts Council England and the Royal Parks for their continued support, and we look forward to welcoming you across our campus, hopefully many times this summer, at the pavilion designed this year by Marina Tabassum. There are going to be many events in the pavilion. As always, the pavilion is a content machine, but also the Play Pavilion, which is a partnership with Lego and designed by Peter Cook, and of course also at our exhibitions by Giuseppe Pennone in Serpentine South, and here and North by Abita Singh. And last but not least and foremost and above all, I want to finish by thanking the extraordinary, amazing arts and technologies team, without whom none of this work would be possible. In particularly, Victoria Ivanova, Tommie Introna, and Kay Watson, who have led on Future Art Ecosystem 5, and to the wider team, Vi Trin, Ruth Waters, Tamar Clark-Brown, and Eva Jäger. We should all give them a very, very big round of applause. And it's now my immense pleasure to hand over the microphone to Kay Watson, Head of Arts and Technology at Serpentine. Big, big welcome to Kay.
Hi, everyone. I know I've got another microphone on my face as well, and I look really stupid, so sorry. As you know, I'm Kay Watson. I'm Head of Arts Technologies. I've just thought I'd repeat that. So I'm just going to give you a brief overview of how we find ourselves here today before I hand over to Victoria Ivanova and Tommie Introna for a presentation of FAE 5. So in 2020, the day that the UK went into lockdown, the exact day, Serpentine launched our first ever edition of Future Ecosystems, or FAE, as I'm going to call it. And that volume began with a mapping of the field of art and advanced technologies with a view to us supporting the development of artistic practices and fellow public sector organizations working in this field. Now, shortly, I'm going to hand you over to Victoria, who's been leading FAE for the last 5 years with our colleague Tommie, to tell you a little bit more about that story. But since then, the project has grown significantly into a community of artists, technologists, policymakers, researchers, and fellow organizations, whilst also contributing to our own strategic vision. So the briefings have also supported Serpentine Arts Technologies' ongoing commitment to champion, support, and produce work with artists whose practices make an immensely important contribution to how society understands and uses the technologies of the present and the future. In 2024, the release of Future Ecosystems 4, Art and Public AI, coincided with Serpentine's Year of AI and the exhibition of Rafiq Anadol that was followed by Holly Herndon and Matt Dryhurst, The Call, which was their first major UK exhibition to develop new protocols and materials for the creation of Coral AI models that also resulted in a Coral Data Trust experiment, which we'll also hear more about. In 2025, obviously the release of Future Ecosystems 5, Art and Creative R&D, coincides with artist Danielle Brathwaite-Shirley's most ambitious public exhibition to date. Hans-Ulrich has already mentioned it, a new collaborative video game exhibition and R&D project that interrogates the civic potential of video game technologies. But this is, I just need to reiterate that this is being supported by the Future Ecosystems team to ensure that the creative R&D that forms part of that project is enabled and shared with the sector and beyond. So the real reason I'm doing a speech now is so that I can thank some people. There have been a lot of people involved in the creation of FAE 5. Firstly, thank you to all the contributors, advisors, and researchers who gave their time and expertise so generously, many of whom are here. Lots of you actually are here tonight. Over 60 people contributed their time and expertise to support the development of the project. To Roxy Zaiher, who's not actually here, who's designed each FAE publication for the last 4 years. To Lena Martin-Chan, who is here somewhere. Where are you? Are you hiding? Oh, there you are. Thank you. Who's both a guest producer and contributor this year. And to Nick Hood. Where are you? Thank you. Nick has joined us as a guest co-writer this year and was absolutely integral to this report. So, round of applause. And also to the whole Serpentine team, and the Arts Technologies team. This is a real team effort. None of this is possible without all of our colleagues. So I am now going to hand you over to Victoria and Tommie to present Phase 5.
Wow, they're really entangled here. Yeah?
That's okay, I guess.
Okay. Yeah? Okay, cool. Well, good evening and welcome. I'm Victoria. I'm R&D strategic lead at Serpentine. I'm joined by my colleague Tommie, R&D producer. Well, first of all, thank you so much for making it out here on such a hot day. I hope everybody's really well hydrated, and yeah, the fans are in action, so that's good. So we're here at Serpentine tonight, an organization that is really well known for its exhibitions and its public-facing programs, something that you can easily encounter by walking into the exhibition spaces. Perhaps some of you have also been here to see exhibitions that Hans-Ulrich has already mentioned today earlier by such artists as Holly Herndon, Matt Dryhurst, Gabriel Masson, or Ian Chang, to name just a few artists with whom the Arts Technologies team has developed new work over the past decade. Now, what's not immediately obvious when you walk into the exhibition spaces is that these exhibitions, these projects, could have not existed or come into existence without extensive creative R&D work. So while exhibitions present an immediate experiential encounter that is super well established as a format, there's no such defined and immediate interface for creative R&D. In many ways, a lot of contemporary art practice suffers from this final staged objects versus behind-the-scenes process misperception. But in the case of art and advanced technologies, this issue of format recognition, or lack of recognition, risks undermining one of the most valuable aspects of artistic and cultural engagements with advanced technologies. Advanced technologies, the way that we approach it, is not just a medium or a conceptual reference. Whether it's AI, blockchain, or game engines, the technical affordances and the possibilities of these technologies are deeply enmeshed with questions of imagination, perspective, and all forms of conditioning. The space of art and advanced technologies is dedicated to the exploration of these enmeshments. As such, it presents a lab for testing how we want to live with and govern new technologies. Critically, it is a space that at once overlaps with, but is ultimately outside of scientific research and the tech sector. And it is driven by an exploratory and relational agenda rather than narrow specialisms and market dominance, thereby serving a critical role that is larger than the production of new experiences and artworks. So to zoom out a little bit, Future Art Ecosystems began as an observation about this latent potential of the art and advanced technologies ecosystem, and the fact that the institutional formats that we have inherited, such as collecting, exhibiting, or staging, are insufficient to advance this potential. This observation does not just apply to Serpentine or other visual arts organizations. It is true for almost any cultural organization or artistic practice that engages with emerging advanced tech today. Over the past 6 years, Future Art Ecosystems has been gradually and iteratively building a case for a different approach, mapping new territories of cultural and technological innovation, and offering more comprehensive visions for how art and technologies can serve as a critical space for negotiating the development of advanced technologies today. So, previous briefings, before we came to Phase 5. So each briefing has always functioned as an agenda-setting space around a specific technological space. And our approach has always been to be very cognizant of current developments, but also to highlight the unique contributions that art and culture can make to the evolution of these spaces, which might not be so evident or widely discussed. And in the practice of practicing what we preach, Kay has alluded to this already, we have used some of the proposals as blueprints to inform how we operate as a department, and also what R&D we undertake as part of our larger collaborations. So, for example, the 2023 briefing on decentralized technologies led to collaboration with artist Tomás Cereceno and an organization called Radical Exchange on the development of a stewardship model for socially engaged art. And then the 2024 briefing on public AI informed our partnership with King's College Center for Data Futures, a specialist in data governance, a big legal team, well, not so big, but a really good legal team, on developing a participatory governance model for AI training data that was used to develop the AI models by artists Holly Herndon and Matt Dryhurst. You can read up on these prototypes, as well as obviously the briefings on the Future Art Ecosystems website. Also worth mentioning that there in the corner, we are selling the little books. So obviously you can access them online. You don't need to buy them to read them, but they're a cute object that you should have. The Fay 5 book will be printed later this year to coincide with the opening of Danielle's show in September. So finally, coming to the meat of it all. So our latest briefing on Creative R&D articulates why it is necessary to acknowledge Creative R&D as a distinct format of art and tech activity, and to place it alongside other more familiar cultural formats, such as collecting, staging, and exhibiting. Today, Creative R&D is characterized by the fact that it operates across traditional organizational and sector boundaries, integrating diverse knowledge domains and addressing a broad spectrum of challenges related to advanced technologies. In this sense, Creative R&D overlaps with more narrow methodologies, but is also complementary to them. And the definition that we propose as an anchor for the briefing builds on the internationally accepted approaches, as well as the work that has already been done in this country since the 2010s. The main contribution that Fay would like to make to the existing conversations is to present a perspective on Creative R&D that positions artistic practices and cultural organizations as sites of technological innovation, rather than as simply settings for downstream application and commercialization within the context of the creative industries. So, to this end, the Fay briefing explores Creative R&D through two lenses. First, by offering a view on Creative R&D led by artists, and second, by shining light on how cultural organizations provide essential infrastructure for different forms of Creative R&D, plugging into broader cross-sectoral innovation ecosystems. Critically, we pointed barriers, and we also make some very concrete proposals for addressing these barriers. And so in the Blitz presentation of the key findings on these two dimensions, I will just hand over to Tommie, and then the panel will focus on the propositions and the proposals.
Thank you. So, through our research and experience producing new projects in this arts and technologies field, we found that artists working with advanced technologies defy the popular myth of the isolated creative genius dedicated exclusively to self-expression. Instead, they embody a relational networked identity, connecting and translating across the separate contexts to drive innovation at multiple scales. This might be very familiar to you all, but it's important to outlay. We identify three primary modes through which artists partake in the innovation ecosystem. They convene publics in and around technological phenomena, offering a forum for public interest development. They set new strategic visions by expanding collective imagination towards alternative technological futures. And crucially, they engage in different forms of systemic interventions, building tools, infrastructure, operational entities. These processes are often integral to artistic production methodologies, but in Fay 5 we highlight them as distinct capabilities that require specific support and recognition to harness their potential. I'll quickly run through some of the case studies that we feature in the report. Thanks, Victoria.
I need to have a job.
Artist Lauren Lee McCarthy's practice examines transformations of social relationships in the context of automation, surveillance, and algorithmic living. In recent work, she is co-designing a driverless car system with members of the public. Through test rides, part art performance, part co-design practice, Lauren challenges our preconceptions about who can participate in the development of so-called frontier technologies. Such interventions open a space for new narratives to be developed and alternative futures to be imagined. In our interview, Lauren told us, artists are able to imagine futures and possibilities that are outside of what already exists, beyond the ways of living that we've seen before, and for anything to be really possible, it first has to be imagined. But Lauren's work goes beyond imagination, speculation, and performance. She makes systemic interventions that shape culture and innovation. In 2013, Lauren created P5.js, an open-source JavaScript library for creative coding. It's now used by over 4 million users worldwide, which is wild, and provides a fun and accessible entry point into computing. And it's taught to many people coming to computing for the first time. Ian Chang, who's been mentioned many times already, so I don't need to do much of an introduction. But it's interesting to note that Ian's practice has evolved from creating autonomous AI agents predominantly in art galleries to founding Opponent Systems, a startup that extends his work with live simulations with a specific focus on games and experiences for young children. Opponent Systems is guided by a profound question: what systems do kids need to navigate the dramatic decade ahead? Thank you. In Ian's work, the technical and the cultural are mutually constituted. He moves fluidly between art making, machine learning development, play-based learning, and software entrepreneurship. Ian's interest in tackling engineering challenges advances technical innovation in cutting-edge AI research domains, as well as developing multimodal interfaces that can withstand and engage young users, but also move beyond conventional text-based AI interactions. This approach demonstrates Creative R&D's capacity to make significant contributions to technical development, drawing on artistic methodologies and sensibilities to bring new ideas and approaches into the fold. Natsai Audrey-Chiesa is a designer and founder. She established Faber Futures in 2018 after working at the biotech company Ginkgo Bioworks. There, she recognized the value that artists and designers bring to R&D in science and technology labs. Faber Futures explores biofabrication possibilities using organisms such as bacteria, fungi, and algae to develop new materials, processes, and applications across different sectors. Through their work, culture and creative practices are placed upstream within the innovation pipeline. And cultural institutions themselves also become valuable sites of R&D. In our interview, Natsai conveyed that the value of collaborations with cultural institutions because they present unique opportunities to transform production systems and a space to stress test technologies differently. Similar to Lauren and Ian's contributions, what makes Faber Futures' work so important is its ability to tackle the wicked problems that we're all grappling with today. By straddling and interfacing multiple domains and leveraging Creative R&D to pioneer alternative business and production models, they offer a values-driven approach to innovation and in the public interest.
Do you want to do it from now on?
Oh, I can do it. So, infrastructure. So, beyond individual artistic practices, we also found that significant creative R&D is led by cultural organizations themselves. This includes collaborations with artists on specific projects, but it also extends to organizational development and distinct innovation initiatives. These organizations undertake diverse activities spanning research, incubation, production, prototyping, network building, skills development, scaling, and civic engagement. Whilst established frameworks exist for making such activity visible and legible within research and industry contexts, within the cultural sector, we lack equivalent structures. For this reason, FAE 5 proposes a taxonomy for understanding the different types of cultural organizations currently engaged in this work, creating a foundation for recognition and support. So, we see three main organizational models operating across the broader cultural space. Departments and spin-outs of established organizations, such as our team at Arts Technologies at Serpentine. Dedicated art and advanced technologies entities, such as ACME, the Australian Centre for Moving Image in Melbourne. And self-organized grassroots initiatives like Trust in Berlin. And we'll be hearing more about ACME and Trust in the panel. These organizations harness their unique positioning at the intersection of public engagement, creative practice, and knowledge production. Their function extends beyond their traditional roles of physical space provision and curatorial support to instead encompass the development of technical infrastructure, research frameworks, and collaborative networks. A couple of examples. The Node Library at 221A in Vancouver represents a distinctive departmental spin-out model. The Node Library is a distributed compute framework that will enable SMEs, cultural institutions, libraries, and educational institutions to operate their own data infrastructure. It evolved from 221A's core function as a traditional artist-run center transforming its cultural infrastructure mission into specialized technological capabilities. This focus on protocol-level development bridges cultural and technological sectors through practical applications for cultural data rights and community governance of digital assets. The Design Museum's Future Observatory functions as a research institute dedicated to the relationship between design and climate change. In 2024, the Design Museum achieved independent research organization status, and through the research entity augments its traditional museum functions with large-scale cross-sector research. This model positions the museum not merely as a presenter of completed design research and works, but as an active participant in shaping how design practice responds to planetary scale challenges. Here at Serpentine, and you've also heard a bit about this so far, and hopefully many of you saw it in action last year. Here at Serpentine, through our Creative AI Lab and through Future Art Ecosystems, we have long been interested in the questions around governance in AI pipelines. Last year, we published our briefing, Phase 4, Art and Public AI, where we made proposals for how to reshape our approaches to data stewardship. The commission of a new work by Holly Herndon and Matt Dryhurst presented the opportunity to sandbox some of these proposals. Holly and Matt's desire to produce AI models that can synthesize a choral singing voice, trained on a custom data set of recordings with community choirs, posed a number of interesting research questions. What would good faith AI development look like? Could the data set become another output from the gallery, from the exhibition? What legal and governance frameworks are necessary to deliver this? And how do we engage community choir members to build their preferences into the governance model? The experiment involved creating legal and technical frameworks that allow institutions to act as trusted intermediaries between artists, audiences, and AI researchers, ensuring that data sharing happens according to community-defined values. This R&D process assembled a network of collaborators, including AI researchers, data governance experts, lawyers, artists, academics, and many more. And you can read about this if you're interested on our through Future Art Ecosystems website. And I'll hand over back to you.
Okay, so there's a slightly illegible diagram, but perhaps, I don't know, maybe people in the front row can do a bit of a live commentary. But what this diagram is trying to illustrate, so in the center you have Creative R&D that's being hosted and advanced and cultural organizations. And then there are different concentric circles across 4 domains: technological, cultural, democratic, so societal, and economic. And the closest circles, they show the very kind of self-evident ripple effects, such as new business models, plurality of new ideas kind of emerging, speculative scenarios that can be mapped onto potential developmental trajectories for technology, and then public presentation as a very obvious thing that happens through hosting. And then as we move sort of outwards, we get slightly more ad hoc, but at simultaneously perhaps more interesting spillover effects. So for example, could cultural organizations become alternative test beds for specific technologies? And as we heard from Tommie, some of the artists definitely think that is the case, and that's one of the reasons why they're incentivized to work with cultural organizations instead of scaling up in traditional ways. Could, for example, cultural organizations also spin out new organizations? And this, I think, is a model that we're seeing more and more of, and hopefully, something that can become mapped and like rationalized in a more coherent and formal way. So beyond like all the kind of positive possibilities, it's also really important to acknowledge there are a lot of barriers, especially barriers in reaching these kind of outer concentric circles of more ambitious objectives. And while it is clearly there's a lot of potential in creative R&D that emerges through artistic and cultural contexts, the 3 barriers that we have identified revolve around both fairly obvious things, but simultaneously quite deeply rooted problems. So the first is the language of R&D is somewhat alien to art and culture. And conversely, within an innovation context, art and culture is not really recognized as a space where serious innovation happens. Now, we believe that perhaps this cultural change can happen if we develop alternative measurement models and are able to actually track R&D activity in a more bespoke manner. Because without the ability to track this work and to make arguments for it, we're kind of back to square one, which is in some ways the picture that we paint in this publication, where there's a lot of this activity, it's interesting, but it remains largely invisible and ad hoc. Now, this is further exacerbated by the fact that today, Creative R&D is primarily funded by leveraging project-based funding, which is not always fit for purpose as it constrains risk-taking and the kind of iteration that goes into more open-ended and ambitious research endeavors. But let's not leave on such a pessimistic note. So we make some pretty high-level proposals, which might sound a bit wild coming from a cultural organization, particularly because they are really aimed at fundamental policy change. However, we believe that these proposals would be the most effective ways of addressing the barriers that we currently described. And it's worth emphasizing that none of these proposals are inherently novel. And in fact, they coalesce with the concerted efforts of many organizations and those of you present here today. And what we hope that our contribution achieves through this publication, our continued dedicated work in this area, is to bolster the case for Creative R&D as a recognized format in art and culture. And we look forward to working on this together. And now we'll have a panel that will be moderated by Kay Watson. Thank you.
Thank you, Tommie and Victoria. So for the next 30 minutes, we're going to have a discussion that takes its cues from this final chapter, and which we call proposals, which are a series of policy and funding recommendations to grow and support this ecosystem, and the individuals, organizations, and infrastructure that are integral to its development. And also, because I don't know if everyone can see it, I'm going to read them out. So our first is to establish a cross-departmental entity for the advancement of Creative R&D, to broaden the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology's definition of R&D to encompass Creative R&D, to adopt ecosystem measurement models, and to diversify funding mechanisms and approaches to account for the full spectrum of Creative R&D activity. Now, what is worth me saying, obviously some of this sounds quite bureaucratic and there is realness within this, but we are, really trying to talk about making direct impact to the sort of support of this work. It's also very UK focused, what we're talking about here. Now, it's worth saying the report does talk a lot about the UK context, because we think it's important that we are able to do that. But inherently, this work is international in scope, and all of the people that we've spoken to are practicing across the globe, are collaborating across the globe as well. So we're just doing this kind of, we're sort of creating a dialogue between those two areas. So I'm bringing in this panel today of wonderful colleagues, contributors to FA5, as I said, to bring life to these proposals and to bring their diverse perspectives, experience, and knowledge to the conversation. We have Keri Elmsly, Tao-Tao Chang, Alex Declino, yes, Hannah Andrews, who are bringing the viewpoint of the artist, practitioner, producer, curator, policymaker, funder, amongst many others, to this discussion about the value of Creative R&D, art and technology practices, and why the art field can be a key actor in the development of technologies that benefit society. So, to begin, I'm going to ask each panelist to introduce themselves, because there's nothing worse than listening to someone read a bio off a page. So I'm going to ask everyone to introduce themselves and very quickly talk about their relationship to this field for 3-ish minutes or less. We then have a series of questions, and we'll have a bit of a discussion. If we have time, we'll take a couple of questions, but we're here until 9 o'clock. We'd love to have a chat with anyone and everyone about this publication, so we'll see how we go, and we don't want to keep people sat in this heat for too long. Keri.
Hi. I'm just back from 11 years away from London, so I'm actually learning and arriving as this briefing is published. And I've had a relationship with Creative R&D and advanced technology since the 90s, where I lived with some cyberpunk sculpture group called the Mutoid Waste Company, and in techno sound systems in a group called Spiral Tribe. So really came up, we're talking about top down and bottom up. So I came bottom up through experimenting with technology and then moved into working with artist studios like United Visual Artists, who were early practitioners of interactive art, who used and subverted military technologies to develop their own tools, who then invented what's now the world's leading media service, Disguise, as well as maintaining a really rigorous artistic practice. From there, I had the privilege to work with artists like Quayola, who built his own code system to control robots. I then worked with Jonathan Reiki from Somerset House on the planning of Somerset House Studios, which you all know about its legacy and what it's doing live and direct now. With the jump to America, where I worked in many contexts, but top-down in corporations, which has been fun. And I was senior vice president at Sphere Studios as the Sphere in Las Vegas was under development and build, where artist prototypes inform the experience principles of the Sphere itself, as well as feeding many, many new patents. And then from there, I joined ACME, which is why I contributed to this report, where I was executive director of programming, and part of my responsibilities there, as well as curating strategy and exhibitions, was leading ACME X, which is the sort of living ecosystem of creative R&D for screen-based practitioners. And so I find myself back here discovering what this rich theme is now in 2025 in the UK.
Thank you. And Alex.
Hi, I'm Alex. I am a video game designer and co-founder of Moving Castle, which I think relates to this whole topic of creative R&D being a project that started as a simple essay that we wrote around 3 years ago, and then slowly evolved, like kind of resonated within like art and tech crowd, and evolved now in a video game company. Got funded by 10 companies, and I'm also one of the, like Moving Castle has now legitimized itself as a company and also opened a space in Berlin called Sibyl, which is it's a for now very fluid experimental space related to mostly like gaming and art, and it's one of Moving Castle is also one of the many projects that spawned from Trust, so also a good example of like this collaborative environment that then spawns very different projects. Yeah.
We can get to that.
Okay.
Tao.
I'm Tao. I am Associate Director at the Arts and Humanities Research Council for Infrastructure and Major Programs, which we always shorten to IMPS. We do. We really do.
Research
and the
loves
reason
an
is,
acronym.
and then the reason behind that is it gives us an excuse to raid collections of medieval manuscripts and to use some of the marginalia and the sort of little beasties in the margins as Christmas logos. Arts and Humanities Research Council is one of 9 organisations or 9 bodies within UK's largest public funder for research, development and innovation, RD&I. It's called UKRI. And if you think about UKRI as a star system, so with the sort of corporate hub in the middle, and its 9 orbiting bodies, then AHRC, the Arts and Humanities Research Council, is like Pluto. So we are constantly having our planetary status questioned, occasionally stripped, and then put back again. So it's quite an interesting existence. But if you think of the sort of total annual budget of UKRI, it's about 8.8 billion, and AHRC gets just under 100 million. So that's what I mean when I see Pluto. I look after a portfolio of investments, which are all around studios, spaces, and platforms. They are facilities, and they are sort of aimed at enabling creativity and innovation in arts and humanities research. Some of the investments that you may have heard of include CoStar. That's I can never remember the acronym. So it's Convergent Screen Technologies and Performance in Real Time. It's about virtual performance, but it's a distributed capability. It's UK's. We're hoping to sort of turn it into the UK's national capability for experimentation in all the Rs, AR and VR and XR, but certainly at the intersection of what is live and what is not. And that's a £76 million investment for the first 6 years. Also, RICHES, I have the best acronyms, the Research Infrastructure for Conservation and Heritage Science, and that's an £80 million investment to enable access to heritage science facilities, and that was repositioning heritage-led research as a critical driver for innovation in areas such as imaging, bioimaging, sensing, and digital twins and visualization, simulation technologies. And then the most recent one is DISCO, Distributed System for Scientific Collections. I know, they are the best, aren't they? And that's a big collections digitization project. It's delivered in partnership with the Natural History Museum. And that is also looking at how arts and humanities-led research and collections-led research can be converted. When we couple it with technologies, with compute, it can turn into a tool to inform coordinated global action on to mitigate or manage the impact of climate change and land loss and food security. Is that enough?
Yes, perfect. Thank you. Hannah.
Hi, I'm Hannah. I am the Director of Digital Innovation in Arts at the British Council. My background in arts, working with arts and technologies and creative R&D, goes back a pretty long way, running artist studio spaces for early career artists working with technologies, curating the arts and technologies, and electronic music festival Convergence some years ago now when that was still running in Shoreditch. I spent 5 years at Google Arts and Culture Lab, producing collaborations between artists and engineers, and now work with teams across the British Council's global arts portfolio to really think about not so much, what is the impact of technology on international collaboration, but really actually how that network that you spoke about, Kay, that network of artists that are collaborating, that are working together, that are experimenting in culturally diverse contexts with technologies. We think about how that is a site of immense resource when we're looking at these innovation agendas that are, that need to represent people. And one of the things that maybe will lead into the discussion that I think we reflect on a lot at the British Council, and I talk about a lot with teams, is this idea that we talk a lot about cultural representation in technologies through the lens of an ethical or a cultural rationale, which of course is really important, but also when you look at, you mentioned the creative industries sector plan, when you look at the funding that's going into, the modern industrial strategy in general, when you look at the funding that's going into innovation, ensuring that any innovation that happens in the UK is connected to international contexts in a really meaningful, culturally situated way, there's a huge business case for it as well. And so seeing the arts as being this channel, this opportunity, these international creative collaborations and experiments with technology as being a way to ensure that we're developing representative, diverse, and therefore much more resilient technologies is a huge area of opportunity to be tapped into.
Thank you. So I have 3 quite long questions. So I'm going to start with this one. So collaboration across sectors, disciplines, and fields is one of the sort of key benefits, if you like, or markers even of creative R&D that is rooted in art and technology practices and contexts. For a multitude of reasons, including bringing multiple perspectives to technology development and many other things that we've discussed already. Much of this emerges currently from a bottom-up perspective, in the way that artists and different kinds of organizations are developing projects. And obviously in these set of recommendations, we're talking also about top-down frameworks required to cultivate the work from a policy and funding perspective. So, could you talk about your experiences of this collaborative approach from your perspective? Sector, top, bottom, wherever. And what would you say would support the growth and development of this as an established field of practice? And I think something we talked about before is please do draw attention to any projects or practitioners throughout the conversation, because I think it's really important to bring, the work to this as well, like the real work that's happening. So yeah, a question to everyone.
Where's the top in this? How top is top? Is that covered in the diagram? I mean, I'm happy to jump in on that. I mean, I think that what you've done really well in these proposals is when you look at these kind of top-down approaches to facilitating cross-disciplinary collaboration, I don't necessarily think that there is, and Tao, you might disagree with me, I don't necessarily think that there is a huge need to develop or redevelop substantial infrastructure. It's more about removing barriers to access. So it's more about, allowing creative R&D to have the same tax benefits that scientific and technological R&D has. This is like the boring revolution, but having standard industry classifications that don't completely semantically distance the arts from technology and therefore mean that funding flows in wildly unrepresentative ways of the way everyone in this room is practicing, broadening the definition of independent research organizations so cultural venues can receive those funds. And that is the kind of, it's the creating of an environment rather than a top-down approach to innovation that I think genuinely will facilitate this area of practice. Because the artists and institutions and organizations and people in this room will create their own infrastructure and already have if those barriers are removed.
I would agree. So I actually do agree with everything you said. I think certainly as a public funder, the first thing that you look to is your community, because the communities hold the knowledge and the expertise and the drive, and they will tell you what the future ought to look like or might look like. So in terms of a top-down approach, it doesn't work unless, if you look at, I think back to, CoStar, the sort of virtual production and R's studios, they came into being because the community said there are these opportunities, but the creative industries, and this particular bit of the creative industries, is overwhelmingly made up of small businesses, small micro businesses, or freelancers. And so the opportunity for us was to de-risk the R&D and to provide access to these communities and these sectors to the technologies so that they can try something out. Now, it's not perfect. We're not at the point where whatever it is that they're trying or the widget that they're testing or developing can actually then go directly to market. But it begins to build confidence within business to start doing their own R&D and to start investing more sustainably in these opportunities. And we were very careful with CoStar to ensure that, if it's virtual technologies, then people will say, well, virtual production technologies. And the first thing people will say, well, that's engineering, isn't it? It's physical sciences. What's it doing in the Arts and Humanities Research Council? And the argument that we made was that technology and the boundaries of invention and technology are pushed further, first and foremost, by human imagination and storytelling and the appetite for storytelling. And that actually puts a very, very different lens on which you sort of look at technological innovation. Just so that people, in December 2023, there was a publication by the Prime Minister's Council for Science and Technology, which looked at arts-led and arts and humanities-led R&D, and looked at one of the recommendations was for tax credits and to recognise that. So that's quite interesting as well.
Keri, I can see you're going to say something.
I know I have a very active face. Sorry.
No, I need it so that I know who to ask.
I want to mention some examples of success because I think we're like really far into this. We're not new, and that's why the strategic briefing is important. Like New Ink in New York has been going for over 12, up to 11 years, and Somerset House Studios not far long behind it. And there's some really distinct criteria, and I've had the privilege to work with New Ink as a mentor, and I'm also learning much more about Onyx and the Onassis Foundation, which balances between New York and Athens. So each criteria, each sort of place has its own culture, and it doesn't exist without community. But to have community requires ongoing investment of really, really talented people and space. So Somerset House Studios is a good example of hardcore dedicated space and resource and time. So the community exists in terms of studios, but it also exists in terms of dedicated gallery space. So it's not fighting the program to have its own space. And in New Ink in New York, they don't have their own dedicated exhibition space. But what they have is incredible mentors, and it's almost like FOMO if you don't get to be a mentor. So they've done a really tremendous job of building not just a strong alumni community, but a very strong mentor community, so that the drive to be part of New Ink is far bigger than the cohort of any one year. And then what under their current director, Salome, who's part of your report, and Julia, who's been part of your report, and Stephanie, who was the director in between, they've all done some really tremendous work at not just fundraising, but shifting, again, the identity of a Creative R&D facility into the integrated fabric of what it is to be a museum or a cultural institution. And that's the same at ACME. And I think if organizations are not willing to subsidize space or equipment, because the equipment that we're talking about in advanced technology requires ongoing spend. And people do it because they think it's interesting for a couple of years and then they give up and they're going, why does it cost so much money? And that's the fact. So unless you have those kind of criteria, and Onyx did something really great where they're in a less than ideal space in New York. It's a basement inside a tower block up by the Rockefeller. Like, it's not cool. Not the space, the neighborhood. But what they've done in their short time is built partnerships, and this year they've curated Tribeca Immersive. So rather than centering their activity and their output on their own space, they're pushing their output into established spaces where audiences will gather. And then with ACME, with the creative residency, with ACME X, we've had so many. What I love about that's been going since 2016, and it's had multiple operational permutations, but it's only when we moved into the renewed space where the actual offices of the museum and the creative residency were inhabiting the museum itself, where we could push the outcomes and also the invitation. Because if you don't create welcome, if it's just a siloed practice, it's not going to become part of... This is table stakes for art. I don't know another way to say it, but working like this is table stakes for making art in 2025.
Alex, I wondered if you could talk about your relationship to trust.
Yeah.
As a space where new ideas, organizations, artworks, collaborations emerge.
Yeah, I think trust is a perfect example of all this discussion. For whoever is not familiar, trust is I don't know actually the definition of trust, but it's a co-working space. Let's say it's a co-working space. It's a Discord community, but it is just generally a space where in Berlin where people pass through, can meet, can work from, can scheme and come up with ideas. And it is very much a place where there isn't it's very, very horizontal place that really gives space for private conversation and a community to emerge. And my experience is I had a residency at Trust and where I developed like a project, and then from that project, an ongoing discussion with some of Trust member, Arthur's one of the founders, but also other people from there, kind of like emerged, and it was the time where the metaverse discussion was very active, and we decided to like kind of like voice some of the discussion we had internally of like how it would be nice to actually have a counter proposal to this concept that is more decentralized, that is more autonomous, and that led us into like writing an essay. And so it's very much like, I think like at Trust, many of these things happen where there is a large community and there's like micro community that form around specific topics, and then these kind of like communities organize and kind of voice like an idea, a concept that is in the air, and then like a project spawns and kind of like leaves. So it's kind of like Trust is like trees full of spores, and then the spores like kind of go and like bloom and do other things. And so for Moving Castle was very much like this. Should I stop or should I?
No, I would like to keep.
yeah. So I mean, it's a very bottom up approach, I guess. For us was like taking like writing this essay, see the essay kind of resonated, and again like being this very horizontal discussion group almost. And then kind of like once we realized that there was some feedback, some positive feedback from it, was actually to like starting to turn some of these more theoretical and academic ideas into like a practical proposal. And in our case, it was like the development of a series of game. With the game, we also developed like some tools, like just game engine tools that people found interesting and decided to like kind of like fund us to see how much further we could push it. And so slowly from like this, from this like horizontal bottom-up approach, at some point becoming like a company last year, we kind of realized that we actually had to switch from a more top-down, more productive, less like theoretical approach, and that caused a lot of questions within us. And what we are experimenting with right now, for example, in the way we run our project, is to alternate from a bottom-up approach and a top-down approach. So we have a research phase where there is more horizontal, where everybody contributes, and then we go like into like production phase where it's more like people has more strict roles, and that kind of makes us more productive and more clear up the production process. And then we, again, in release, we kind of have, again, like a bottom-up approach with the community, because like I think a central part of our project is that the community was always feeding back into the project. So it's really like the community was part of our initial fundings, and a lot of the community actually like built the games with us. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's very interesting because it's, some of those things, I guess, certain ideas might be picked up by someone else who will take and run with that, which is also one of the things that should be happening, right? Which is like this ability to share. It's not all about, I guess what we're not saying is like every artist needs to have a startup. Do you know what I mean? It's like we're not saying that, but there are these different kinds of practices and ability to share the sort of tools and infrastructure, ideas, whatever that are being created for either other people to pick up and to, work together or whatever is the right. There are so many different routes. We are really running out of time, and I've only asked you one question. So, I think because we talked a little bit about funding and investment, and I think one of the things I wanted to talk about was just like different forms of incubation and development that you may have experienced. Because I think, Victoria mentioned this, but this sort of current focus on like latter stages of tech development, user experience design thinking towards product development, but also something that we bring out in the report that we're saying is that artists in the cultural field are not only engaging with what you might call soft technologies, right? So we are artists and cultural organizations also not only just engaging with screen-based technologies. We're talking about AI, we're talking about communications technologies, we're talking about biotechnology. And interestingly, in the UK, on a policy level, those things are kind of separate. So art does screen, and they do immersive technologies. Everyone else does AI and everything else. And that is obviously, I would say, a bit of an error. What I was going to ask is your experience of kind of, we've seen this from Trust, talking about these alternative forms of incubation, but, what are those, like, other forms of funding, development, production to support that work? Keri.
I can talk about production and making.
Yeah.
So, one of the things that we do at ACME a lot is Audience Lab, which is quarterly, but it's also with our academic partners. But it's an application process, and really nothing exists without the audience or the player. So if you're going to make something, you can't do it without a play test. So we've opened up the museum to build our audience to regularly expect to engage in work in progress.
Yeah.
And so we have work in progress nights, which are informal. Anyone can come and showcase something or test something. And we've had people as young as 13 come with their mums to show us their script or to show us their game, initial design. And then Audience Lab is a bit more rigorous, where it's in the museum for a whole weekend and it's getting kicked about by all the kids, literally. Or it's on the floor and you build it with $500, and that's just how it's going to be. So those are the sort of practice things. And then the other thing I wanted to bring up is reuse and borrowing. I think we all get embarrassed to say that we don't have enough money. But people are willing to help and lend stuff and lend gear, and the reuse part goes to some of the more systemic challenges of going, I've got to invent my own tool, I've got to invent my own platform. And what you find in a successful community is that people share knowledge organically, and they help each other out without having to be mediated to help each other out. So that's why having a pretty diverse range of people in a creative R&D scenario gives that sort of, a filmmaker can help, a video game maker can help but from an institutional perspective, I think the siloed nature of institutions means they don't act like their own R&D spaces act. And so the argument I could make is your IT guys and gals and people and your infrastructure and operations people should be your best friends. And if you're not bringing each other along for the ride, you're going to be acting like a 20th century organization. So a good positive example is we've had our head of technology at ACME invented AI ambassadors, which was basically lunch and learns for anyone and everyone to learn about how we use AI in our everyday lives and then think about how we apply it in tools and collections. So again, organizations have collections and precious objects, and if you can't make something searchable and visually searchable really quick, then people aren't going to look for it or they're not going to find it, so all of this knowledge gets lost. So we developed a set of tools at the museum that is now being loaned, taught to other things. So again, just reuse and borrowing is because otherwise it's just not going to happen. So these are old-fashioned notions, but they're really relevant.
No, sometimes you're just going to keep repeating the same thing over and over again. I'm just going to ask one more quick question, and I hope Hannah and Tao, you may want to answer this, because I just want to ask about systems of measurement, right? And this is something that's very close to the Future Art Ecosystems heart, and something we're looking to push forward in the aftermath of this publication. So the way that we are systems of measurement are currently designed do not demonstrate the value and impact of this as an ecosystem. And I think it's important that we're talking about ecosystem rather than just individual practices or individual institutions. It's about how everything fits together. But also how this activity is kind of new and emergent at times, not always, but particularly for the cultural field, for the art field, I would say. So what do you think about the development of new metrics? What are other what are alternative measures of success. And we were talking about this before, like the difference between financial versus economic metrics, but also we need to just like not always be thinking about money, or at least institutions and those do need to be thinking about money. We need to know how to make the argument to ensure that artists that continue can actually make work. And are there any metrics that you're using?
Do you want to get Yeah, it's a really important question. And I guess one thing I've just been reflecting on, particularly listening to Keri and Alex, the amazing work that you've done to set up these spaces, these infrastructures, these approaches to creating, is obviously that can't, and why this makes sense, this panel, is that can't happen unless there is appropriate stimulus that is being injected into the arts so that work can be done. And I think the British Council is in a super interesting position in that regard, because we are we're a funding body, we support artist practice, but we also advocate for why that artist practice matters. And I guess, the funding models also that interest me are the ones that are more discursive, that invest in open-ended exploration and exchange. And I think in articulating why those matter, there's a big piece of work to be done in articulating why they matter to not just AHRC or the culture-focused elements of government, but also to the Department of Science, Innovation and Technology. And that's, I think, how we resituate this area of work, which is already pretty well understood. And I guess in that, there is just really clearly evidencing the fact that when artists create new work with technology, when artists reimagine technology, that has direct spillover effects into industry, into the way that the engineers, Holly and Matt, are the perfect example of that with their work on the call. But you see it in other examples like Linda Dunia-Rebez in Senegal, who's working to diversify ecological data sets with Senegalese flora and fauna, or Harsha Agrawal, who's training generative AI in India on Sayam and Kathakali dance rituals. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is that artist-led experimentation with technologies can be articulated as having real-term impact on the technologies themselves, which then can be integrated by tech companies, if you want, to make their technologies more efficient. And that actually has value. That's what I mean by the business case. That has real value. And maybe that's economic in the long run, but actually what it is in the short run is human. It's deeply human. It's about showing that we as people and our diversity of histories and stories are represented in the technologies that are mediating our experience. So I guess that spillover effect is one way to measure, and that is something that we measure against at the British Council. Another measurement and evaluation metric, which was hard won, was that the projects that we fund engage people, the general public in the governance, use and regulation of technologies, because that's often what is most opaque. And that is where meeting people on their own terms can really invite a much more engaged public dialogue in these, ultimately pretty transformational models that will impact us all.
Yeah, I would agree with... just agreeing with you this evening, but usually I would anyway. I think I'd say two things, but I promised Kay that I would be a little bit provocative this evening, so I will be. I would say that artists of any professional community, an expert community that I've encountered, are best placed to bring knowledge and insight and perspective to really tough, difficult issues, climate change or AI, any of the things that threaten us here and now, to a wider public, and make that link, enable policy to be meaningful and impactful, and for the wider publics to engage in a way, with these difficult issues and with technologies. And I think, just drawing on what Hannah was saying, participatory research or participatory methods and artist-led methods should not be seen or framed as a bit diluted, a bit sort of wishy-washy. You can tell from my expression I don't agree with this, yeah. they are method. They are a way of testing particular hypotheses and enabling a change in perception. Now, we take the very, very sort of knotty issue of AI and its prevalence and sort of the fact that it's everywhere. Whether we like to acknowledge it or not, these technologies that listen to us and analyze us and create algorithms to enable sort of prompt us to spend more money and do more of these are things which are all around us. If what we don't want to have is that AI and technology becomes the new Latin. Once upon a time, if you read Latin, then you were in the room that made the rules. If you didn't read Latin, then you were not, and that was very, very simple. There is a scenario whereby AI and technologies and software and things like that become that kind of the marker of that divide, and it's the artists and creative community that if you have participation, then knowledge goes to the communities that these technologies most impact and affect. And if you have impact, or then you have curiosity and a desire within communities and wider publics to find out more. And then you have a self-generating regulation, checks and balances. And only, I would say, the artists and creative community is able to do that in a non-contentious and accessible way. And you're not claiming your own, is what I am saying as a funder at the moment. I do not see the creative and artistic community claiming this as their thing, their contribution to the future of humanity on this planet. I don't see it often. So I think you need to be much, much more clamorous about claiming and making this legacy.
This is where organisations have an extremely important role. Now, we are so far over time, but I'm going to stop there. Thank you, Hannah, Keri, Tao, Alex, for joining us today. Thank you, Victoria and Tommie. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, everyone who's come out tonight. Please stay and have a drink and have a chat. But yeah, thank you.